He was a man the world called untouchable, Ethan Cole billionaire, visionary, a symbol of power wrapped in glass. He built an empire that touched millions, yet he himself never touched anyone. Not a handshake, not a hug, not even the brush of a hand. Success had made him unstoppable, but fear had made him untouchable. Until one night. A night when the rain fell hard over the mountains of Colorado. A night when fate placed him in a broken-down car beside the one woman who would see the man behind the armor. Grace Morgan, his quiet secretary with eyes that saw pain where others saw perfection. That night, everything changed. This is not just a story about love. It's about walls that crumble, hearts that thaw, and the moment a powerful man remembers what it means to be human. Because sometimes, the storms we fear the most aren't the ones outside the window. They're the ones inside us. And if we're brave enough to face them, they don't destroy us. They save us. Stay with this story, because somewhere in Ethan Cole's silence, you might just hear your own heart learning to beat again. Ethan Cole had everything the world said a man could want. At 42, he was the CEO of Cole Dynamics, a global powerhouse valued in the billions. Magazines called him the untouchable executive, a name that seemed to fit him almost too well. Reporters wrote about his genius, his discipline, his empire, but few ever wrote about the silence that followed him wherever he went. In every meeting, every handshake he politely declined. There was a quiet line drawn 2 feet of invisible distance that no one dared to cross. Colleagues said he was private. Some said he was strange. But those who worked closest to him knew better. They knew there was something deeper behind that calm voice and measured gaze, something wounded, like the echo of a door that had closed long ago and never opened again. He lived in patterns, not moments. His mornings began at 5. Black coffee, a run on the treadmill exactly 4 miles, shower, oatmeal, the same crisp gray suit. His life was a clock wound tight, and the rhythm of its ticking gave him control his only real comfort. Yet, for all his distance, Ethan was not unkind. He was fair, respectful, and almost painfully ethical. He never raised his voice, never forgot a birthday, never took more credit than he deserved. He ran his company with precision, but also with conscience. People trusted him, even if they could never quite touch him. Rumors floated through the hallways of the 45th floor. They said that years ago, something terrible had happened, an accident, a loss, a night that left him changed. No one knew the truth, but sometimes, when the world went quiet and the city lights flickered against the tall windows of his office, Ethan would glance at his reflection and see not the powerful man he had become, but the boy who had once reached out for help and found only emptiness. That was the part of him no one saw, the part he hid behind success. When Grace Morgan arrived at Cole Dynamics as his new executive secretary, the office whispered again. She was calm, composed, with an air of quiet understanding. There was nothing flashy about her soft brown hair, always tied neatly back. Eyes that seemed to listen more than they looked. She understood personal space, respected silence, and had a rare sensitivity for the unspoken. Where others pushed, she waited. Where others filled the air with noise, she let stillness do the work. From the very first week, an unusual rhythm began to form between them. Mornings became a quiet choreography. The distant hum of the espresso machine, the soft shuffle of papers, the muted tap of her heels across the marble floor. She'd place his coffee no sugar, just a dash of cream at the edge of his desk, never closer than necessary. He'd nod his thanks without lifting his gaze. And in that simple exchange, something human flickered, fragile, wordless, real. There were no grand gestures, no sudden breakthroughs, just 2 souls orbiting carefully within the gravity of routine. She learned his moods not by words, but by the tension in his shoulders, the way he stared at his screen a little too long when something bothered him. And he, though he would never admit it, began to find a strange comfort in her quiet presence, the steadiness of someone who didn't demand, didn't pry, didn't try to fix him, Sometimes, as the sun dipped behind the Denver skyline, Grace would glance up from her desk and notice him standing by the tall windows, staring out into the fading light. The city below shimmered in silver and gold, rain often streaking down the glass like tears that belonged to another time. He would reach out, his fingertips resting lightly against the cold pane, as if that thin layer of glass was the only thing left safe enough to touch. And in that moment, the distance between them felt smaller somehow. She never said it aloud, but Grace sensed that the man everyone called untouchable wasn't avoiding the world out of pride. He was protecting it from something inside him he couldn't yet name. The days passed this way, measured, efficient, strangely peaceful, each one identical, yet holding within it a quiet promise that something, someday, might shift. Ethan didn't know why the presence of this gentle woman made the office air feel softer, or why her quiet footsteps calmed him more than silence ever had. He only knew that when she was there, the world felt a little less sharp. Outside, Denver's autumn skies turned heavy with rain. From the 45th floor, the clouds looked close enough to touch, pressing down against the glass in muted shades of gray. Ethan stood alone in his office one evening as thunder rolled far away, the sound low and distant like a memory returning. He didn't flinch, didn't move, only watched the raindrops race each other down the window. Then, almost without thinking, he lifted his hand and placed it against the glass. Cold, smooth, unyielding, the only surface he had allowed himself to touch in 20 years. Behind him, the office lights hummed softly. The world carried on. But, for a fleeting moment, Ethan Cole, the billionaire who never touched anyone, let himself feel the pulse of the storm outside and the faint echo of warmth stirring somewhere deep within. And though no one saw it, a crack appeared in the walls he had built so carefully around his life. It was small, almost invisible, but through it, for the first time in a long while, the light could begin to find its way in. For days after that quiet evening by the window, something invisible shifted in the air between them. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of change anyone else could see, but it was there soft as the first hint of spring after a long winter. Ethan Cole moved through his days as he always had, precise and contained, but there was a subtle difference in how he breathed, how he looked out the window, how his eyes seemed to linger a moment longer when Grace spoke. Grace noticed, though she never said a word. She had long learned that some silences are not empty. They are full of things people cannot yet say. Their working rhythm continued like clockwork. Every morning, the same ritual unfolded. Grace arrived 10 minutes before 8, her steps quiet but purposeful. On his desk, she'd set his coffee, strong and black, just the way he liked it. Her own cup mirrored his no sugar, no cream, but she always drank hers standing near the corner of her desk, never at his table. The space between them remained measured 2 feet exactly, maybe less on some days, but never touching. That distance had become its own kind of language. It spoke of respect, of boundaries, and perhaps of something far deeper, an unspoken understanding that closeness, for him, was not a casual thing. In meetings, she stood slightly behind his shoulder, handing him documents without ever brushing against his hand. When they walked through the corridors, she kept pace beside him, matching his stride, never too near, never too far. The rest of the staff noticed the precision of their movements, the seamless coordination, and wondered how 2 people could seem so attuned, yet so apart. And though Ethan never spoke of it, there was a quiet comfort in her steadiness. Grace never filled the silence with unnecessary words. She didn't pry or analyze or offer sympathy he had not asked for. She simply was there, a steady, warm presence that neither demanded nor intruded. There were small moments, too, moments that would mean nothing to anyone else. The way she'd glance up and meet his eyes when he seemed lost in thought. The way she could sense when his tension built, and wordlessly hand him a folder or a reminder that grounded him back into the present. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something purer, a recognition between 2 souls who had learned to survive by being careful. But one afternoon, that delicate balance wavered. It was raining again. the kind of steady, quiet rain that made the city blur into shades of silver. Grace had stayed late, finishing a quarterly report. Ethan was still in his office, sleeves rolled up, jacket draped neatly over the chair. He looked tired in a way that success could never fix. When she brought in his evening coffee, she set it down carefully beside a glass mug that had been on the edge of his desk. Her sleeve brushed it by accident, and it slipped, shattering against the marble floor. The sound broke through the quiet like a crack of lightning. Grace knelt at once, startled. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Cole." He was beside her in a heartbeat, the instinctive part of him overriding the careful walls he'd built. "Don't," he started, reaching toward her, but before the word was finished, he stopped. A thin line of blood traced across her palm, bright and human and real. He froze. His hand hovered in midair so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His breath caught, his eyes fixed on the crimson drop forming at the edge of her hand. For an instant, he wanted to close the distance. He wanted to help, but the memory of cold stone and the weight of old fear pulled him back. Grace saw at the flicker of pain behind his restraint, and she understood. She smiled softly, the kind of smile that forgives without needing to be asked. "It's all right, Mr. Cole," she whispered, her voice calm, almost tender. "Some wounds need air to heal." He looked at her, then not as his assistant, not as an employee, but as someone who had seen the truth he'd spent years hiding. Something inside him shifted, a quiet recognition, the smallest spark of trust. Grace rose slowly, wrapped her hand in a tissue, and continued as if nothing had happened. But the air between them had changed. The distance was still there, yet it no longer felt like a wall. It felt more like a bridge, fragile, waiting, but real. That night, when she left the office, Ethan remained seated long after the city lights came on. His mind kept replaying her words, the gentle certainty in her tone. Some wounds need air to heal. He had spent years sealing every hurt, locking them away behind discipline and success. But what if healing didn't come from closing wounds, but from letting them breathe for the first time in a very long while? That thought didn't terrify him. It humbled him. It softened something deep inside. Outside, the rain fell steady against the glass, tracing familiar lines down the window pane. He watched the drops slide and merge, like separate lives finding their way together, slowly, naturally, and though Ethan Cole remained, in every public sense, the untouchable man, there was now a quiet difference in his heart, because in that office, beneath the hum of rain and fluorescent light, someone had dared to touch him without ever laying a hand. After that rainy evening and the quiet moment when Grace's words lingered between them, some wounds need air to heal. Something subtle began to shift inside Ethan Cole. He wouldn't have called it change, not yet. But there were moments, brief and unguarded, when he found himself breathing a little easier. The air in his office no longer felt quite so thin. Days moved forward in their measured rhythm. Business carried on, meetings filled the calendar, numbers rose and fell. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Yet, when Grace entered the room, Ethan noticed how the tension in his shoulders eased without his permission. It wasn't comfort exactly, it was presence, a kind that asked nothing, and somehow offered everything. Then came the meeting that would alter the course of both their lives. It started with an email, a strategic partnership proposal from Hale Manufacturing, one of the largest industrial firms in the country. The board called it an opportunity, but to Ethan, it felt like a storm forming on the horizon. The project required him to travel something he hadn't done willingly in years. The plan was to visit a new facility high in the Colorado mountains, tour the site, and meet the executive team in person. For most CEOs, such a trip would be routine. But for Ethan, the thought alone stirred old shadows he'd spent decades avoiding. The idea of leaving the glass safety of his office, of being confined in a vehicle on narrow mountain roads, brought back a wave of unease he couldn't easily name. He told himself it was simply inconvenient. But deep down, He knew it was fear, quiet, familiar, and merciless. When he read the agenda aloud in his office, his voice remained steady, but Grace saw the shift in his expression, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers tapped once, then stopped. She understood more than he said. "Would you like me to coordinate from here, Mr. Cole?" she asked gently. He paused, glancing up from the screen. "No, I'll handle it." There was a flicker of hesitation before he added, "Though, perhaps you should join, for support." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because she was the only person who made silence feel safe. Maybe because some part of him knew he couldn't face the open road alone. Grace nodded with quiet composure. Of course. And just like that, the decision was made. The morning of the trip arrived gray and heavy, the sky swollen with unshed rain. Ethan's driver brought the car around a sleek black Cadillac Lyric, polished to a mirror sheen. The city still slept as they pulled away from the curb, Denver's lights fading behind them. Inside the car, the hum of the tires filled the quiet. Grace sat beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes on the horizon. She didn't ask if he was all right. She didn't need to. Her presence alone steadied the rhythm of his breathing. They drove north, the road stretching like a silver ribbon through the foothills. Trees rose tall on either side, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. The higher they climbed, the more the world fell away the city, the noise, the masks people wear. For the first hour, Ethan said little. His gaze remained fixed ahead, every muscle in his body disciplined against the unease creeping through him. Grace occasionally pointed out a view, a waterfall glimmering through the trees, a hawk circling above, but she never forced conversation. She knew when silence was its own kind of company. After a while, she spoke softly, as though to the air more than to him. "My father used to drive roads like this," she said. "He was a firefighter, the kind who ran toward storms instead of away from them." Ethan turned his head slightly, surprised by her tone, calm, reflective, without sadness. "He died in a mountain flood," she continued. "I used to think the storm took him, but now I believe it changed him first. Maybe that's what storms do." He didn't respond, but something about her words settled into him, quiet and persistent. The sky darkened as they climbed higher, clouds closing in over the ridges. The air grew cooler, and the sound of rain began to whisper against the windshield. Each drop seemed to echo against the car's smooth shell, rhythmic and haunting. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His breath came shorter, shallower. Grace noticed the faint tremor in his hand, the flicker of tension in his jaw. "You don't like closed spaces, do you?" she said softly. He hesitated, then exhaled, a sound more like surrender than confession. "No." She didn't press. She only nodded, eyes on the rain. "Then maybe this mountain's a good place to start trusting the open again." Her voice was steady, anchored, like someone who had once learned how to steady herself in chaos. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel judged. He just felt seen. Outside, the rain thickened, fog curled around the pines, soft and pale, wrapping the road in a gauzy veil. The rhythmic sound of wipers marked their slow ascent, steady and hypnotic. Then, from the car radio, a voice crackled through the static severe weather alert for Clearview Pass. Thunderstorms expected this evening. Possible flash floods. Drivers advised to take caution. Grace glanced at him. He met her gaze briefly long enough for both to understand that what lay ahead wasn't just a business trip anymore. The storm was coming. But neither of them knew that, beyond the rain and winding road, the distance that had kept them safe for so long was about to be tested by nature, by fear, and by the fragile human need to reach across the space between one soul and another. Outside, the clouds thickened into dark, rolling waves. The first flash of lightning split the sky. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan Cole, the man who had built his life around control, something began to stir again. It wasn't panic this time. It was the faint, trembling sense that change, real change, was no longer waiting at a distance. It was already on the road with him, disguised as rain. The warning from the radio faded into static, leaving behind a silence thick enough to feel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The road wound upward, curving through the gray morning like a ribbon caught between earth and sky. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather. Beside him, Grace watched the mountains rising ahead, majestic, solemn, almost indifferent. They had come too far to turn back now. The first miles passed in steady rhythm, the soft hum of the tires, the muted percussion of rain on glass. Through the mist, pine trees stood tall and solemn, their needles glistening with water. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar, the kind of scent that carried both memory and melancholy. It was beautiful, and yet isolating. The higher they climbed, the fewer signs of life they saw. No gas stations, no cabins, not even a passing car. Just miles of winding road and the low sigh of wind through the branches. Grace tried to keep the air light. She spoke softly about small things, how the mountain roads always reminded her of family trips when she was a child, how her mother used to hum old country songs to fill the silence. Ethan responded politely, but his answers were short, clipped, as if each word cost him something. Yes, maybe, I remember. His gaze stayed fixed on the road, on the sharp bends and narrow shoulders that fell away into mist. The windshield wipers brushed back and forth, like the ticking of an anxious clock. After a while, Grace let the silence return. She had learned that sometimes. Pushing against silence only deepened it. Still, she could sense the unease building inside him, the way his breath shortened each time the road curved too close to the edge, the way his eyes flickered to the mirrors again and again. Finally, she said quietly, "You don't like mountain drives." It wasn't a question. Ethan's jaw tensed. "They're unnecessary," he replied. "Meetings can be done over video." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not everything that matters fits on a screen." He didn't answer, but she saw the corner of his mouth move somewhere between a sigh and a reluctant acknowledgement. The rain began to fall harder, streaking across the windshield in silver lines. Visibility shrank. The world beyond the headlights turned to a soft blur of gray and green. Inside the car, the air felt closer, heavier. Grace glanced out her window and spoke, almost to herself. "My father used to say storms make people honest. You can't hide in one. You can only get through it." Ethan turned his head slightly, his voice low. "Your father? He was the firefighter, right?" She nodded. "Yes. He spent half his life saving strangers, and the other half trying to teach me not to be afraid of the world. When I was a kid, he used to take me up roads like this. Said mountains have a way of reminding us how small we are, but not in a bad way, just humbling." Her eyes softened, caught between memory and loss. "He died in a storm like this, years ago. A flash flood up near Estes Park. He and his crew were rescuing a family trapped in a cabin. The rain came faster than anyone expected." The sound of the rain filled the car, heavier now, almost as if nature itself paused to listen. "I used to hate storms after that," she said quietly. "But over time, I realized they weren't just things to fear. Sometimes they strip life down to what really matters." She glanced at him, her tone gentle but sure. "You can't fight a storm. Ethan, you wait it out. And sometimes, it changes you." Her words hung in the air steady, unhurried, and true. Ethan said nothing. He didn't know how to, but inside him, something shifted. The weight of her voice stirred an old ache he hadn't touched in years. He thought of his father, how his hand had gone cold long before the help arrived, how Ethan had sat in the dark, trapped beneath stone and silence, learning too early that touch could mean loss. Now, as the rain thickened and thunder rumbled far above the peaks, he felt that same tightness return to his chest. Only this time, it wasn't panic, it was memory. The car curved around another bend, the road narrowing to a single lane. A thin waterfall spilled down the rocks beside them, sparkling briefly before disappearing under the tires. Grace leaned slightly forward, watching the streaks of water race each other down the glass. "Funny thing about storms," she said softly. "You never really know when they begin. Sometimes it's not the first drop of rain, it's the quiet before it." Ethan glanced at her. Just for a moment. There was something steady in her expression, something that felt like faith not in the weather, not in luck, but in the simple act of enduring. He turned back to the road, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when it ends," Grace smiled faintly, "you look around and realize you're still here. Maybe a little shaken, maybe a little changed, but still here." Outside, the sky deepened from gray to charcoal. The wipers fought against the downpour, each pass less effective than the last. The rain became a living thing, relentless and rhythmic, drumming against the car's frame like a heartbeat. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel, his pulse matching the rhythm outside. He could feel the storm pressing closer, as if testing him. But this time, he didn't reach for control. He simply drove steady, cautious, present. Grace turned slightly toward him, watching as the tension in his shoulders softened, just barely. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The mountain road stretched ahead, swallowed by fog and rain. Yet, inside the car, something had shifted, small but unmistakable. Two people, bound by silence and circumstance, had begun to share the same rhythm. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't entirely alone with his fear, and somewhere deep within him, beneath layers of habit and restraint, a quiet truth began to surface that sometimes the only way out of the storm is through it. The rain had turned from steady to merciless, as if the clouds had finally surrendered everything they'd been holding back. Sheets of water blurred the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep pace. The mountain road had narrowed to a thin gray ribbon, twisting through a world of mist and thunder. Inside the Cadillac Lyric, the air felt heavy, thick with silence, thick with things neither of them dared to say. They had been driving for hours. The road ahead looked endless, the world outside reduced to shadows and motion. Grace sat quietly, her hands folded, her gaze tracing the lines of rain that streaked down the glass like tears the sky hadn't meant to cry. Beside her, Ethan's posture was rigid, his focus absolute. But beneath that calm, something trembled. He could feel it, a pressure, a memory building behind every breath. The sound of the storm wasn't just rain anymore. It was a heartbeat. A rhythm that grew louder, faster, until it seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside him. The car hit a sharp curve, tires skimming over slick pavement. Ethan eased his foot from the accelerator, adjusting the steering, his mind tightening with calculation. Then, without warning, the dashboard flickered once, then again, and went dark. The soft hum of the electric engine faded into silence. The wipers stopped mid-swipe. The world shrank to the sound of rain pounding against the car's roof. Ethan blinked, once, twice, his hand moving instinctively to the ignition. Nothing. He tried again. The screen stayed black. A low exhale escaped him, not fear exactly, but the edge of it. "It's the battery," he murmured. "It shouldn't die this fast." Grace leaned forward slightly. "We're out of range." "No signal," he said, checking his phone. The screen confirmed it. No service. Outside, the storm raged. The rain hit the glass with a sound that felt alive, relentless. Lightning flashed across the ridge, illuminating the trees in a sudden white blaze before leaving them in darkness again. For a long moment, neither spoke. The car became a capsule of isolation, soundproof from the world, but not from their own fears. Grace looked around. The mountains had vanished behind curtains of fog. The road had become an empty vein through the wilderness. No cars, no lights, nothing but rain. She inhaled slowly, her voice calm but careful. "We're okay. Ethan, we'll wait it out." He nodded, but his breathing had already quickened. The stillness pressed in from all sides. The air felt too close, the walls of the car suddenly too near. His fingers twitched against the steering wheel, searching for rhythm, for something to control. Grace saw at the distant look, the stiffness in his shoulders. A man trapped, not by the storm, but by something older, deeper. Then came the memory. It wasn't sudden. It crept in, soft as a whisper, until it filled every corner of his mind. The smell of dirt and gasoline, the choking dust, the crushing silence after the sound of collapse. He was 15 again, trapped beneath fallen beams, the weight of rubble pressing against his chest, somewhere nearby. His father's voice had called out once, just once, and then never again. The dark had felt endless then, too. The air had been thick, unmoving. He remembered reaching out in the blackness, his hand searching for another's touch, and finding only the cold, still hand of a man already gone. That was the day the world had taught him that touch could hurt, that closeness could destroy. Now, decades later, inside the quiet hum of a car stranded on a mountain road, that lesson replayed itself with cruel precision. Grace's voice broke through the memory, soft and grounded. "Ethan," she said gently, "look at me." He didn't at first. His gaze was fixed on the windshield, on the endless rhythm of rain. His breathing came shallow, uneven. She reached out instinctively, not thinking, not planning, just acting from that quiet, human impulse to help. Her hand found his shoulder, resting lightly. It wasn't much, just the warmth of skin through fabric. But to him, it felt like the first real touch in 20 years. He froze. For a fraction of a second. Every instinct told him to pull away, to retreat, to rebuild the space that had always kept him safe. But something in her touch was different. It didn't demand, didn't invade. It was simply there, warm, steady, kind, and he didn't move. The rain became softer in that moment, or maybe his mind quieted enough to hear it differently. The sound against the roof turned rhythmic, almost gentle. His breath began to slow. Grace didn't speak again. She just kept her hand where it was, letting him decide, letting him stay. After a while, Ethan's eyes closed. He let out a slow, uneven exhale, the kind that carries not just air, but years of held pain. When he opened his eyes again, they met hers. There was gratitude there, raw and wordless. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind howled through the trees. The rain traced silver rivers down the glass. But inside the stranded car, a quiet stillness began to form, fragile, human, real. Neither of them knew how long they sat like that. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. But something essential had shifted, like the first crack in a frozen lake before the thaw. Ethan Cole, the man the world called untouchable, had let someone reach him, not with logic or pity, but with something far simpler. And though the storm outside showed no sign of ending, the one inside him had finally begun to break. When Grace finally withdrew her hand, it wasn't out of hesitation, but trust. She smiled faintly and whispered, "See, sometimes the world doesn't end when you let someone in." He didn't answer. He couldn't. But in the soft reflection of rain on the glass, Grace saw the truth before he could say it himself. Something long frozen had begun, at last, to melt. And deep within that quiet, broken-down car, surrounded by wind and water and memory, the first fragile spark of healing took root, small, trembling, but alive. For a long while after the car went silent, they said nothing. The storm outside raged on, relentless, as if determined to test the strength of everything left standing. But inside the stranded Cadillac, time seemed to slow into something quieter, more human, more fragile. Ethan sat still, his breath uneven but calmer than before. Grace's hand had already withdrawn, resting now on her lap. Yet the warmth it left on his shoulder lingered, as if his body didn't quite know how to let it go. Neither of them dared to break the silence. The rain filled the space between words, steady and alive. It drummed against the roof like a heartbeat constant, patient, reminding them they were still here. As the temperature inside the car began to drop, condensation gathered along the windows, turning their reflections into soft, hazy ghosts. Grace shivered once, her breath visible in the dim light. Ethan noticed. Without thinking, he reached for the coat folded beside him, his charcoal wool overcoat, still dry enough to offer warmth. He hesitated for a moment, the instinct to retreat tugging at him like an old reflex. But something deeper, quieter, spoke instead. He turned to her. "You're cold," he said softly. Grace gave a small, polite shake of her head. "I'm all right," but she wasn't. Her lips were pale, her fingers trembling slightly against the seat. He didn't argue. He simply lifted the coat and draped it around her shoulders. The fabric brushed her cheek as he did. And for a second, their hands met briefly, accidentally, but undeniably real. Neither moved. Her skin was cool from the cold air, his hand warm from the effort of control. That simple contact sent a quiet shiver through him, not of discomfort, but of recognition. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel the need to flinch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even obvious. But for Ethan Cole, the man who had spent half a lifetime guarding himself from touch, it was as profound as an awakening. He pulled his hand back slowly, unsure what had just happened, unsure what it meant. The air between them shifted gentler now, filled with something neither of them could quite name. Grace looked at him, the faintest trace of surprise in her eyes, but no questions. She seemed to sense that silence, once again, was the safest language between them. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, shaking branches against the glass. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, softened by the rain. Yet inside, the air felt warmer, as if something unseen had lit a small fire between them. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He stared at his hands, as though they belonged to someone else. For years, they had built empires, signed contracts, commanded boardrooms, created order out of chaos. But now, after one unplanned touch, they trembled. Is this healing, he wondered silently, or another illusion he didn't trust moments like this? He had spent too long surviving to believe in warmth. The mind played tricks, he knew. It could make pain feel like comfort, and comfort feel like danger. But then he looked at Grace, her face lit softly by the dashboard's faint emergency glow, and something inside him quieted. There was nothing false about her. She wasn't trying to fix him, or reach him, or turn his pain into poetry. She was simply there, cold, tired, human, and yet somehow, the calmest thing in the storm. Minutes passed, neither spoke. The rain softened, turning from violence to rhythm. The sound filled the silence like a lullaby, written by the weather itself. Grace adjusted the coat around her shoulders and gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. Ethan nodded. "You're welcome." His voice came out lower than he expected, steadier. It carried none of the sharpness he often used in the boardroom, only a kind of fragile honesty. The kind that exists between people who have stopped pretending. Grace leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closing briefly. "It's strange," she murmured. "The world feels quieter when you can't run from it." He looked at her, puzzled for a moment, then let the words sink in. There was truth there, quiet and unsettling. For years, he had built his life around movement, around control. Now, trapped by circumstance, he was forced to stop. And in that stillness, he could finally hear what he'd been drowning out. The rain, the wind, his own heartbeat, and hers. He turned his gaze toward the window, watching as the storm pressed its palm against the glass. For once, he didn't feel the need to look away. Grace shifted slightly, the coat slipping off one shoulder. He reached instinctively to adjust it, fingers brushing the fabric near her arm. Again, the smallest spark of warmth. Again, that strange absence of fear. He didn't understand it, but maybe healing wasn't something to understand. Maybe it was something you allowed. He thought of all the years he had spent avoiding touch, believing it was protection. But maybe, he realized now, it had been a kind of exile, not from others, but from himself. When he glanced back at Grace, she was looking out at the rain, eyes calm, hands folded in her lap. There was a quiet grace to her, no pun intended, a steadiness that made even the storm outside feel less intimidating. Ethan followed her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't see the storm as something to fear. He saw it as a mirror, chaotic, yes, powerful, yes, but also cleansing, alive. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips, small, uncertain, but real. Grace noticed, and her own smile answered his, soft and wordless. They sat there in that silence, two strangers bound not by circumstance, but by something gentler, the shared understanding that sometimes the world strips everything away just to show us what's left. And as the rain began to ease, a strange calm settled over the mountain. The headlights reflected against the mist like faint stars, and the air inside the car grew still again. Ethan leaned his head back, eyes half closed. The exhaustion of the day pressed down, but so did something else, peace, quiet and new. Outside, the storm continued its work, washing the world clean. Inside, two people sat together in its glow, one beginning to thaw, the other steady as light. And though the night was far from over, a small part of Ethan Cole, the untouchable man, knew that something had already changed. Not the storm, not the silence, but the way he felt when someone stayed through both. The rain had softened to a steady rhythm, like the quiet heartbeat of the night itself. The worst of the thunder had passed, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. Inside the car, the air was warm from shared breath and stillness. The headlights had long since dimmed, casting only a faint glow that shimmered across Grace's face and traced the edges of Ethan's reflection on the window. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Words would have felt too loud in that fragile peace. The storm outside had done its damage, stripping the night bare of sound and color, but within the small cocoon of the Cadillac, a different kind of stillness had settled, a calm not born from safety, but from surrender. Ethan's coat still rested around Grace's shoulders. Every so often, a gust of wind rocked the car gently, and the faint scent of rain drifted through the cracked window, cool, earthy, alive. Grace's eyes followed the raindrops as they traced crooked paths down the glass, merging, separating, rejoining again. It reminded her of people, how they came together, drifted apart, and somehow always found their way back to something familiar. Ethan watched her quietly. There was something about the calm on her face that both steadied and unnerved him. He had spent his life surrounded by competence, by control, but this quiet, human resilience felt like something he didn't know how to measure. "You're not afraid," he said softly, almost surprised by his own voice. Grace smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving with a kind of quiet wisdom. "I am," she admitted, "but I learned not to run from it." He tilted his head, studying her. "How?" She looked down for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of his coat. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory, gentle but honest. "When my father died, I couldn't breathe for months. Every sound of rain brought it all back: the sirens, the flood, the waiting. I was diagnosed with PTSD not long after. The world felt unsafe. Even the smallest things could pull me under." Ethan listened, his eyes steady, his silence deep. Grace continued, her gaze distant, as if watching an old version of herself across time. "I tried therapy, medication, everything, but what helped most wasn't forgetting, it was helping others heal. I started volunteering for trauma recovery programs. I realized that healing doesn't mean erasing the pain, it means learning how to live beside it." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "That's how I found peace again. Not by closing the door on what hurt me, but by letting light in through the cracks." For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. Her words landed softly, but with the force of truth. He looked away, out toward the darkness where rain still whispered against the earth. He wanted to speak, to offer something back, but words felt clumsy in the presence of such honesty. Instead, he reached for the one thing he still carried, the story he had never told anyone. "When I was 15, He began slowly. My father and I were trapped in a construction collapse. We were working late, fixing one of his projects. I remember the sound first metal bending, the ground giving way, then darkness. I couldn't see anything. I could barely move. Grace turned to him, her expression soft but focused, the kind that said, "I'm listening." I called out to him. Ethan continued. He answered once. Just once. I reached for him, found his hand in the dark. It was still warm at first. Then it wasn't. He swallowed hard, his voice tightening. We were trapped for hours before they found us. By the time they pulled me out, I couldn't stand the feeling of anyone touching me. Hands meant loss. Skin meant pain. Even years later, it never left me. The air grew still again. The rain slowed, the storm outside losing its fury. But inside, something else had broken open, something raw, honest, human. Grace didn't rush to comfort him. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or offer platitudes. She simply sat there, close enough to share the silence. And that silence, the kind that honors pain, instead of trying to fix it, became its own kind of healing. After a while, she said quietly, "You loved him?" Ethan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. He was the only person who ever made me feel safe. Until that night, Grace's eyes softened. Maybe tonight is his way of giving that back. He looked at her then. Truly looked. The reflection of lightning flickered across her face, illuminating her in brief, gentle flashes. And for the first time in decades, Ethan didn't see loss in someone else's eyes. He saw understanding. A long silence followed, filled only by the rhythmic patter of rain. Grace shifted slightly, pulling the coat tighter around her shoulders. Then, without hesitation, she moved closer until their arms brushed lightly together. Ethan stiffened out of instinct, but the reaction passed quickly. The warmth of her shoulder against his felt steady, familiar, even. "It's cold," she said softly. "We should keep warm." He nodded. The words didn't matter. The gesture did. And then, as naturally as breathing, he let himself lean closer. Grace opened her arms, and he allowed himself to rest there, tentative at first, careful, like someone relearning gravity. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't desperate. It was simply two people finding comfort in a storm neither could control. Outside, the wind howled again, shaking the trees, sending water cascading down the windshield. But inside the car, there was peace, the kind that comes not from safety, but from connection. Ethan closed his eyes. The scent of rain and fabric and faint perfume surrounded him. Grace's heartbeat was steady against his chest, grounding him in a way he hadn't known he needed. For the first time since boyhood, touch didn't mean fear. It meant life. They stayed that way for a long time, not counting the minutes. The storm might have raged beyond the glass, but within that small space, calm had found its way in. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan Cole, the untouchable man, the guarded soul, something had begun to heal. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage of a single moment shared between two people who refused to look away from pain. Because sometimes, peace doesn't come when the storm ends. Sometimes, it arrives right in the heart of it when two hearts finally dare to be still together. The night deepened, and the storm outside moved from anger to exhaustion. Its fury softened into rhythm, rain falling in long, tired sighs against the roof of the car. Inside, the two of them sat in silence, wrapped not only in coats and shadows, but in something unspoken that neither dared to define. Ethan's head rested lightly against the back of the seat, his eyes closed, his breathing even. Grace sat beside him, her hands folded loosely, her gaze on the rain-drenched window where the world shimmered in faint reflections of light. Between them hung a peace so rare, it felt borrowed from another lifetime. When the thunder rolled again, low, distant, almost tender, Grace whispered, "It's easing." Ethan nodded, his voice soft. "Yes, I think it's letting us rest. Outside, The mountains disappeared into mist. The wind had stilled, leaving only the sound of water steady, eternal, like time itself, breathing in and out. The air inside the car had grown warmer, filled with the faint scent of rain-soaked leather and her perfume. Grace turned toward him. His eyes were open now, fixed on some place far away. The kind of look a person has when he's finally stopped running from himself. She studied him quietly, then said, "You look different." He gave a faint, almost disbelieving smile. "How so?" "Like someone who's finally stopped fighting the storm." He didn't answer, but she saw it, the small surrender in his expression, the way his shoulders had loosened. The man who once flinched from every gesture now sat in the dark beside her, breathing easily, alive, present. Minutes slipped by. The rain slowed to a whisper. The silence became softer, safer. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. It simply existed, like a bridge between two hearts learning a new language. Grace turned away for a moment, her voice low. "You know, sometimes healing doesn't come with light or grand miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly in the dark, when nobody's watching." He looked at her. Really looked. Her hair had fallen slightly out of place, her face faintly lit by the dim dashboard glow. She looked human, tired, beautiful, real. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. She tilted her head, her expression tender. "You don't have to. Healing isn't about deserving. It's about allowing." For a moment, the world held its breath. Their eyes met and stayed there, no words, no reason. Just two souls suspended in the same fragile space. Ethan reached out, hesitating only once before his fingers brushed against hers. The touch was light, uncertain, like testing the edge of a dream. Grace didn't pull away. Her hand turned, palm to palm, meeting his halfway. It was such a small thing, yet to Ethan, it felt monumental. The warmth of her skin seeped into him, quieting the old ghosts that had haunted his touch. And then, without thought, without decision, it happened. He leaned forward, and she met him halfway. Their lips touched softly, tentatively, like the first breath after drowning. It wasn't passionate or hurried. It was gentle, trembling, honest, a moment that carried more grace than desire, more truth than words could hold. For the first time in 20 years, Ethan Cole didn't feel like a man broken by fear. When they parted, they didn't speak, they didn't need to. Something within both of them had shifted quietly, permanently. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're shaking," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just remembering how to feel." She smiled too, and for a long time, neither moved. The storm continued to hum its lullaby outside, the rain whispering against the glass like old secrets finally being told. At some point, exhaustion found them. The adrenaline faded, replaced by calm. Ethan closed his eyes, his hand still entwined with hers. Grace rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, slow, certain, alive. And there, in the quiet heart of the storm, they drifted into sleep. When morning came, the world had changed. Sunlight filtered through the thinning fog, pale gold spilling across the dashboard. The mountains emerged from the mist, their peaks touched with white where the storm had left its mark. The air was fresh, cool, carrying the clean scent of rain and pine. Grace stirred first, blinking against the light. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she turned and saw him still asleep beside her, face softened, peaceful. Outside, the world was washed new. She smiled, gently squeezing his hand. "Ethan," she whispered. He stirred, eyes opening slowly. When he looked at her, something in his expression made her heart swell. It wasn't the look of a CEO or a man hiding behind control. It was simply Ethan. "You made it through," she said quietly. He looked out the window at the sunlight cresting over the ridge. "We made it through." And then, unexpectedly, naturally, they both laughed. A quiet, breathless laugh that came not from humor, but from sheer relief. It sounded like life. Moments later, a sound echoed in the distance, the rumble of an approaching engine. Grace turned, eyes widening as a rescue vehicle appeared through the fog, its red lights flashing faintly against the pale morning. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if the world had just handed him a second chance. By the time the rescuers reached them, the sun had fully risen. The storm was gone, leaving only puddles that reflected the light like fragments of sky. As they stepped out of the car, Grace wrapped his coat tighter around her, and Ethan instinctively reached out, steadying her by the arm. It was the smallest gesture, yet it carried all the meaning of the night before. When their eyes met, no words were needed. Something invisible had passed between them, something sacred and quiet and utterly alive. They were no longer two people surviving a storm. They were two people who had been changed by one. And as the rescue team guided them down the mountain, sunlight warming their faces, Ethan glanced once more at the clearing sky. For years, he had feared touch, closeness, vulnerability. But now, as the world opened up around him, he realized something simple and profound sometimes. The only way to feel safe again is to let someone in. He turned to Grace, their eyes meeting through the thin veil of morning light. She smiled, and in that single, wordless exchange, he knew whatever came next. The storm had already done its work. It had broken. Yes, but it had also begun to heal. The rescue truck carried them down the winding mountain road just as the first real light of morning broke through the mist. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving the air sharp and pure, the sky an almost tender shade of blue. Ethan and Grace sat in the back seat, silent, wrapped in blankets offered by the rescue crew. Neither spoke about the night before, neither needed to. Some moments, when held too tightly by words, lose their meaning. When the city of Denver appeared below its skyline glinting in the distance, Ethan felt something strange. The closer they got, the brighter everything seemed, almost blinding. After the gray stillness of the mountains, the glass towers felt too tall, the streets too loud, the light too harsh. He had lived in this city all his life, and yet that morning, it felt foreign, almost unreal. The world had returned to its rhythm. Emails, meetings, the ticking of clocks, the hum of commerce. But inside Ethan, time still moved differently. He felt both fragile and awake, like a man who had been asleep for years and suddenly remembered what breathing felt like. When they arrived at the office that afternoon, everything looked as it had before, the same polished floors, the same efficient greetings, the same distant professionalism. But the air felt heavier. Conversations stopped when they walked by. A few glances lingered longer than courtesy allowed. Whispered words carried down the corridor, hushed but sharp. Grace noticed it first. The shift, the weight, the way eyes followed her and then turned away. She met Ethan's gaze briefly as they stepped into the elevator. He said nothing, but the tightness in his jaw said everything. In the span of hours, the world had already rewritten their story. By the time they reached the 45th floor, the whispers had grown into something with shape and name. The CEO and his secretary, someone said under their breath, stranded overnight in the storm. The words rolled through the building faster than truth could catch them. Inside his office, Ethan stood by the window again, his familiar place. The place he always retreated to when the world demanded answers he didn't yet have. Outside, the sunlight glittered off the wet glass of nearby towers. The same rain that had cleansed the mountains now reflected back at him in 100 distorted shapes. Grace stood near the doorway, holding a folder she had no intention of opening. "They're talking," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied, still looking out. "It'll pass." He turned to her, his eyes tired but kind. "No, it won't." There was no bitterness in his tone, just an old understanding of how quickly people turn stories into entertainment. He had spent years building a reputation of discipline, of untouchable integrity. Now, one night, one human moment had become a narrative others could twist and sell. before either of them could say more. His phone buzzed sharply on the desk. A message from his assistant read, "Emergency board meeting. 2:00 p.m. Conference room 12. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Nathan Hale," he muttered, reading the sender's initials at the end of the message. Hale Manufacturing, their strategic partner, and the man who sat on the board with influence enough to challenge him. Grace lowered her gaze. "They want an explanation." He nodded once. "Of course they do." When the meeting began, the room was a theater of power. The long mahogany table gleamed under sterile lights, surrounded by men in dark suits and women with measured eyes. Nathan Hale sat near the head of the table, his expression perfectly composed, the kind of calm that came not from peace, but from calculation. "Ethan," he began, his tone polite but cutting, "I assume you're aware of the situation." Ethan's voice was even. "If you mean the rumors, yes, I'm aware." Hale leaned back in his chair. "The press has already reached out. One headline reads, 'The untouchable CEO caught in the storm of scandal.' Creative. Don't you think a few members chuckled softly, uneasily?" Ethan said nothing. "We're not here to pass judgment," Hale continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We're here to protect the company's reputation. And right now, that reputation is under threat." Ethan glanced around the table. Familiar faces avoided his eyes. Colleagues he had mentored looked down at their notes. Loyalty, he realized, was often conditional. He spoke quietly but firmly. "Nothing inappropriate happened. Miss Morgan and I were stranded due to the storm. That's all." Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. But the public doesn't live on facts, they live on perception. And perception, as you know, can destroy empires." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. His pulse quickened, but his voice remained calm. "If my reputation can't withstand honesty, then perhaps it's built on the wrong foundation." There was a pause, the kind that follows truth uncomfortable, undeniable. Hale leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "You're an admirable man, Ethan, but admirable men forget that the world forgives success, not weakness." Grace's name was never spoken in the room, but her presence lingered in every insinuation. Each phrase inappropriate optics, public concern, female subordinate was a blade wrapped in civility. When the meeting ended, Ethan walked out in silence. Grace was waiting near the elevator, her expression composed, her eyes steady. She didn't ask what had been said. She didn't need to. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "They'll come after you next." She smiled faintly. "Let them." It wasn't defiance in her voice. It was acceptance, the kind that comes from knowing who you are, even when others don't. Later that evening, the office emptied, leaving only the hum of lights and the muted sound of rain returning against the glass. Ethan stood once more by the window, the city glowing beneath him. But it didn't comfort him the way it used to. The distance he had once built to protect himself now felt like a cage. Behind him, Grace gathered her things, moving quietly, as she always did. When she turned to leave, she paused by the doorway. "Don't let them take this from you," she said softly. He turned. "Take what her eyes held his, what you found on that mountain." And then she was gone, leaving the faint echo of her footsteps fading down the hall. Ethan turned back toward the window, watching the rain blur the city lights into something almost human. The rumors would spread, the board would question, the world would twist what it didn't understand. But deep inside, he knew one thing remained untouched, the truth of that night. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole had felt warmth, not from power, but from presence. And though the world outside demanded explanations, he understood now that some truths were never meant to be defended, they were simply meant to be lived. That night, Ethan barely slept. The city outside his penthouse glowed with its usual confidence, glass towers, busy streets, the restless pulse of success, but he felt none of it. The rumors had spread like wildfire, igniting whispers in places that once carried his name with respect. By morning, even the financial news sites had caught on, turning a night of human frailty into a headline about corporate scandal. When he arrived at the office, the world felt colder. People greeted him with the careful politeness reserved for someone standing too close to the edge. He could almost hear their thoughts. The untouchable executive touched at last. By noon, he was summoned to the boardroom again. The message came from Nathan Hale himself, crisp and impersonal. Attendance required. Discussion regarding company reputation. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. As the doors opened, Ethan saw the familiar long table gleaming under fluorescent light. The air inside was sharp, sterile, too clean to be honest. Around the table sat the same faces who had once applauded his leadership. Today, their eyes avoided his. Nathan Hale sat at the head, his posture straight, his smile polite in that way. Powerful men learn to disguise contempt. "Ethan," he began, his voice measured, rehearsed. "We appreciate you joining us. I'll be direct, for the sake of the company." Ethan took his seat at the opposite end, the distance between them feeling symbolic. "Go ahead." Hale leaned forward slightly. "The board has reviewed the public reaction to recent events. While we recognize that no official misconduct has been proven, perception, as you know, is its own truth in business." His words were smooth, but every syllable carried judgment. A woman from legal added, "Our shareholders are concerned. Ethan, the company's image is built on trust, and that trust is fragile. We have to consider what message is being sent." Ethan folded his hands. "You mean the message that I'm human?" There was a ripple of discomfort around the table. Someone cleared their throat. Hale smiled again, thin and cold. "The world forgives success." "Ethan," he said, echoing his own words from days earlier. "But not weakness." The sentence landed like a blade. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You call compassion weakness." Hale's smile didn't falter. "I call distraction dangerous. Your relationship, whatever it was with your assistant, has compromised the perception of this company. We can't afford to let emotion dictate leadership." The room grew still. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. Ethan looked at each of them, the partners, the board members, the people who once toasted his every decision. They all looked away. In their eyes, he saw not anger, but fear. Fear of being tainted by proximity to someone who had dared to be vulnerable. Hale continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "We're giving you a choice. Ethan, you can remain CEO on the condition that Grace Morgan be released from her position effective immediately. Or," he paused, letting the weight of the moment hang heavy, "you can step down." For a moment, no one breathed. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan sat perfectly still. The world inside him split in two, logic on one side, conscience on the other. He could keep everything he'd built the company, the power, the illusion of control. All it would cost was one woman, the one who had reminded him that life was more than control. His mind began to spiral. He thought of Grace's calm eyes, the way she had reached for him in the dark without asking for anything in return. He thought of how, for the first time in 2 decades, touch hadn't meant pain, it had meant peace. Now they wanted him to erase her, to pretend none of it had mattered. Hale's voice broke through his thoughts, cold and precise. "This is not a punishment. Ethan, it's a safeguard for all of us. I trust you'll make the rational decision." The rational decision. The phrase echoed in his mind like an accusation. Rationality had been his armor for years, his way to survive the loneliness, the loss, the silence that followed his father's death. He had built an empire from that discipline, brick by brick, never allowing emotion to interfere. But now, sitting in that glass room full of polished smiles and moral pretense, he realized something cruel. His walls had not protected him. They had imprisoned him. He looked up slowly, meeting Hale's gaze. "You think weakness is feeling something real?" he asked quietly. "You think integrity means burying the truth so no one feels uncomfortable?" Hale didn't flinch, I think integrity means knowing what the world expects from us and delivering it. Ethan almost laughed, but the sound never came. Instead, he exhaled, long and tired. Then maybe I've been living in the wrong world. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Hale sat back, sensing the shift, but unwilling to admit defeat. Careful. Ethan. Every man who thinks he's bigger than the system eventually learns he's not. Ethan stood, slowly, deliberately. His voice was calm, but something in it had changed. And every system that forgets it's made of people eventually collapses. For a brief moment, silence filled the room again, this time heavier, more honest. Ethan gathered his notes, though there was nothing left to discuss. He turned to leave, and as he reached the door, Hale's voice followed him, sharp and final. You built this company. Ethan, don't destroy it over sentiment. Ethan paused, hand on the doorknob, his reflection faint in the glass wall before him. He thought about the years 20 of them spent building a life defined by distance. The long hours, the perfect records, the constant need to control every variable. It had given him everything he thought he wanted. And yet, at this moment, it all felt hollow. He'd built walls to survive. Now those walls had become his cage. When he stepped out into the hallway, the air felt lighter, thin. Yes, but free. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole wasn't sure what would happen next, but somewhere deep within him, beyond pride, beyond fear, a quiet truth had begun to form. Freedom doesn't always come from keeping what you've built. Sometimes, it comes from having the courage to let it fall. That night, Ethan drove home in silence. The city lights blurred through the windshield, stretching into long ribbons of gold and white. It had rained again softly this time, as if the storm had not quite finished speaking. The drops tapped gently against the glass, patient and rhythmic, like an echo of the mountain rain that had changed everything. He had walked out of that boardroom without an answer, without a declaration. He had chosen silence not because he was weak, but because words no longer held power in a place that worshipped control more than truth. Yet inside him, the decision had already begun to form. The elevator doors opened to his penthouse, a space once admired in glossy magazines for its perfection, floor-to-ceiling windows, black marble floors, a view that stretched for miles. But tonight, it felt hollow, beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful admired, but lifeless. He loosened his tie, set it on the counter, and stood by the window overlooking Denver. Below, the city pulsed with light and noise, people chasing their ambitions, their distractions, their sense of worth. For years, he had been one of them, a man powered by purpose, by order, by distance. But now, after the storm, after her, he could see it clearly for what it was, a cage with a view. When the phone rang, he didn't move. He knew who it would be. He also knew he couldn't bear to hear her voice just yet. But when it stopped, the silence it left behind was worse. He turned toward his desk and saw it, an envelope, white, simple, resting neatly beside his pen. Her handwriting across the front, steady and graceful. For Mr. Cole, he froze. The air seemed to still around him. For a moment, he could almost see her there, placing it down carefully, the same way she had always done everything with intention, with care. He opened it slowly, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The ink was faintly smudged in one corner, as if her hand had paused there a moment too long. Mr. Cole, by the time you read this, I'll have submitted my resignation to HR. Please don't try to talk me out of it. This isn't goodbye to the company. It's goodbye to a version of us the world refuses to understand. You taught me what resilience looks like. I hope, in some small way, I helped you remember what it means to feel. That night on the mountain, when the world fell silent, you were more human than anyone I've ever known. Don't lose that, Ethan. Don't lose what made you human that night. Grace. He read the note twice, then a third time, as if each word might change if he looked at it differently. But it didn't. It stayed gentle, final, true. He set the paper down carefully, though his hands trembled as he did. Then he sat, just sat, staring at the empty chair across from his desk. The space felt wrong without her. Even the silence seemed heavier, less kind. For years, Ethan had prided himself on endurance. He had survived loss, isolation, and expectation. But this quiet absence was something else entirely. It wasn't chaos or confrontation. It was the kind of loss that simply was. A missing presence, a gap where warmth had once existed. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he didn't try to control the ache. He just let it move through him. The sadness, the regret, the truth that he had finally opened his heart only to watch it walk away in the name of dignity. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Drops ran down the tall windows in the uneven lines, reflecting his image back at him. For a long time, he just stood there, watching the ghost of himself in the glass, the immaculate suit, the tired eyes, the man everyone respected but no one truly knew. He raised a hand to the window, his fingertips brushing the cold glass. The same gesture, the same distance, the same invisible barrier that had always stood between him and the world. Only this time, he saw it clearly not as protection, but as confinement. He had built these walls to survive, and now he understood they were the very thing keeping him from living. Behind his reflection, lightning flickered faintly over the skyline. The sound came seconds later, a low rumble rolling through the city. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply stood there, breathing, watching the storm he could not escape but could finally face. Grace's words echoed in his mind, soft but insistent. Don't lose what made you human that night. He repeated them quietly, almost to himself. Don't lose what made you human. The phrase lingered in the air like a prayer. He looked around his penthouse, perfect, silent, untouched, and realized how deeply alone he had been long before she ever arrived. The empire he had built had cost him something greater than time or comfort. It had cost him the ability to feel. Now, in her absence, the lesson felt sharper, truer. Healing hadn't been about her touch alone. It had been about what she reflected back to him, that even brokenness could be sacred, that tenderness was not a flaw, but a kind of strength. He turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the glow of the city and the soft rhythm of the rain. As he walked toward the window once more, he whispered not in grief, but in gratitude, the kind that carries both pain and peace. Thank you, Grace. The city lights shimmered through the raindrops like stars scattered across the glass. His reflection blurred into the darkness, and for a moment, he imagined it wasn't a man looking back, but a boy young, lost, still reaching for his father's hand in the dark. Only now, the hand he reached for was his own. He stayed there until the storm began to ease, until the world outside softened again into calm. The night no longer felt endless. The silence no longer felt like punishment. Because even in her absence, Grace had left him something precious, a seed of truth that could grow only in solitude. That love, in its quietest form, isn't about possession, it's about awakening. And in that empty penthouse, with rain whispering against the glass, Ethan Cole, the man the world once called untouchable, finally let himself be touched by the simplest truth of all. To be human is to love, to lose, and to begin again. The rain didn't return the next morning, but the silence did. It filled the penthouse like a ghost, lingering in every corner, soft yet suffocating. Ethan had slept little, if at all. The letter from Grace lay open on the table, its folds already worn from being read too many times. Her handwriting had become a voice he could still hear, gentle and steady. Don't lose what made you human that night. He tried to go through the motions. The coffee brewed, the phone rang, the emails arrived, one after another, filled with schedules, updates, and numbers that once defined his life. But none of it reached him anymore. It was all static, all noise. 3 days passed that way without sleep, without real food, without anything resembling peace. Each night, when the city finally quieted, his mind refused to rest. It replayed her laugh, her calm voice, the way her eyes softened when she listened. He remembered the smell of rain on her hair, the warmth of her shoulder when the storm had raged outside, and the sound, the steady rhythm of rain on glass that had once calmed him, but now felt like memory pressing against his ribs. He walked through his home like a man inside someone else's life. The penthouse was immaculate, untouched, perfect in every way but one. It no longer felt like it belonged to the living. At dawn, on the third day, Ethan found himself standing by the window again, the city still cloaked in gray. The streets below shimmered with early light, but it brought no clarity, only reflection. The glass showed him what he had become, a man divided between two selves. One was the CEO, the figure the world respected, measured, disciplined, cold. The other was the man who had sat in a silent car on a mountain road and learned, for the first time in years, what warmth felt like. He didn't know which one would survive. The phone buzzed again, messages from Nathan Hale, from the board, from his assistant reminding him of a shareholders' meeting that afternoon. His name, his title, his empire. They were all still intact. The world hadn't changed, only he had. And that, he realized, was the problem. He tried to push it away, to bury himself in habit. He shaved, dressed, tied his tie. He stepped into his shoes like a soldier donning armor. But as he buttoned his cuff, his reflection in the mirror caught him off guard. His own eyes looked back tired, uncertain, human. He didn't see the man from Forbes or Bloomberg or the business conferences where people applauded his composure. He saw a man who had once reached for connection and had been punished for it. By noon, he sat at his desk in the corner office on the 45th floor. The skyline stretched before him, magnificent and sterile. He opened his laptop, but the cursor blinked against a blank screen. He stared at it until it blurred, until the blinking became the rhythm of his own heartbeat. That's when it hit him with the quiet force of truth. He wasn't tired because of her absence. He was tired because of his own captivity. He had spent 20 years building walls around his heart, calling them structure, calling them strength, but they had kept him from life itself. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, eyes closed, and in that stillness, a single sentence surfaced, simple, clear, final. A company can be rebuilt, a soul can't. He said it aloud, softly at first, as if testing the weight of the words, then again, firmer. A company can be rebuilt, a soul can't. It wasn't defiance, it was liberation. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. For years, that hallway had led to rooms of control, to meetings filled with numbers and names and endless ambition. Today, it led somewhere else. When he stepped into the boardroom, Hale and the others looked up, surprised to see him early. The room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Ethan placed a folder on the table. No speech, no announcement, just the truth, written simply in ink. "My resignation," he said. Hale blinked. "You're stepping down." Ethan nodded, effective immediately. There was a stir of whispers, a rustle of papers. Someone said something about contracts and settlements, but Ethan barely heard it. He was already miles away, standing again on that mountain road, hearing rain hit glass, feeling the first warmth of someone's hand against his. Hale's voice cut through the noise. "You're making a mistake. You built this empire. Ethan, don't throw it away over sentiment." Ethan met his gaze calmly. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm reclaiming what I lost." "And what's that? Myself." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that falls when truth finally fills a room that's lived too long without it. He didn't wait for their response. He simply turned and left, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the long marble corridor. By the time he reached the elevator, A lightness had returned to his chest, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a boy. When the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the polished steel. The same man stared back, but something had changed in his eyes. There was still sadness, yes, but underneath it, a quiet certainty. The world outside was still rushing forward meetings, profits, headlines, but he no longer belonged to it. He walked out of the building and into the street, the air sharp and clean after the rain. The city looked different now, not as a battlefield to conquer, but as a place to simply exist. The clouds parted slightly, and sunlight slipped through, resting gently across his face. He inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like pressure. It tasted like possibility. The road ahead was uncertain, he knew that. But he also knew this: he would rather build a life from honesty and heart than an empire built from fear. As he walked away from the tower that had once been his kingdom, his pace was slow but steady. He didn't look back. Some endings, he realized, don't need witnesses, because the moment a man chooses his soul over his title, he's already begun again. The morning after his resignation, Denver felt different. The city was the same bustling streets, the smell of roasted coffee drifting through the air, sunlight bouncing off glass towers, but to Ethan, everything seemed softer, almost slower, as if the world had finally taken a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to be. No meetings, no calendar alerts, no eyes watching, waiting for him to perform the role he had outgrown. There was a quiet freedom in that, strange and uncertain, but real. He walked aimlessly through Cherry Creek, a part of the city he rarely visited. It was a neighborhood alive with small shops and people who looked like they had time to live. The air smelled of cinnamon and rain. He wasn't looking for her, not consciously, but somewhere deep inside. His steps seemed to know where they were going. The small cafe stood on a corner, shaded by elm trees. Its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Open, be kind inside." Something about that made him smile. When he stepped in, the bell above the door gave a gentle chime, and the aroma of fresh coffee wrapped around him. The sound of quiet laughter, the low hum of conversation, the soft clinking of cups, it all felt so human, so alive. And then he saw her. Grace sat by the window, her hair tied loosely, a pen in hand, a laptop open before her. She was writing focused, calm, unaware of the world around her. A half-finished cup of cappuccino sat beside a small stack of papers. For a long moment, he just watched her. There was a steadiness to her, the same quiet strength he had always admired. But there was something else now too, a lightness, as if she had finally put down a weight she had carried for too long. When she looked up and saw him, she froze for just a second, then smiled a small, surprised smile that reached her eyes. "Ethan," she said softly, standing up. "Grace." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "May I?" She nodded, motioning to the seat across from her. Of course. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, the kind that carried everything words could not. She broke it first, glancing at the papers between them. "I'm applying for a position with a non-profit," she said. "They help veterans transition back into civilian work." It felt right. Ethan smiled faintly. "It sounds like you." She tilted her head, studying him. "You look different." He chuckled softly. "So do you." "Is it true," she asked after a pause, "that you resigned?" He nodded. "Yesterday?" Grace's expression softened. "I thought they'd never let you go." "They didn't." He replied, "I let them go." The words lingered between them, gentle but strong. For a while, they just sat there, the hum of the cafe weaving around their silence. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and placed a folder on the table plane, unmarked, held together by a single black clip. "I've been working on something," he said quietly. "For the past few nights." She looked at the folder, then back at him. "What is it?" He pushed it toward her. a plan, a beginning. Inside were neatly printed pages project outlines, mission statements, sketches of an idea still taking shape. Across the top, in simple black letters, were the words Cole and Morgan Consulting, building cultures of empathy. Grace's eyes widened slightly. You use my name? It's yours too, he said. It wouldn't exist without you. She turned a page slowly, reading, her brow furrowed in quiet focus. You want to build a consulting firm, focused on human connection in business, on empathy, he said simply, on bringing humanity back into leadership, training companies to see people, not just performance. She looked up, her expression a mix of disbelief and something softer pride, maybe, or gratitude. That's a big change. Ethan? He smiled faintly. Maybe the world doesn't need more empires. Grace? Maybe it needs more empathy. The words came out quietly, but they carried the weight of everything he had learned. Grace closed the folder gently. Her eyes shimmered in the soft cafe light. And you want me to help you build it? I can't build it without you, he said. You taught me what empathy looks like when it's lived, not just spoken. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grace reached across the table, her hand hesitating for just an instant before finding his. The touch was light, familiar, no tremor, no fear, just warmth. Ethan met her gaze, and in that simple connection, everything they had endured, the storm, the loss, the silence seemed to find its purpose. The world outside the window glowed with afternoon sun. People passed by, busy with their lives, unaware that inside this small cafe, something extraordinary was beginning. Grace squeezed his hand once, steady and sure. Then let's build it, she said. But this time, we start from the heart. Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. From the heart, he repeated. They sat there a while longer, two people who had walked through storms and found their way back to stillness. The coffee grew cold, the light shifted, but neither seemed to notice. Outside, the sky cleared to a soft blue. Inside, a seed of something new took root, an idea, a promise, a second chance. When they finally stood to leave, Ethan held the door for her. The bell above chimed again, the same gentle sound that had marked his arrival. Grace stepped out first, sunlight catching the edge of her smile. He followed, no longer the untouchable man he once was, but something far better. Someone who had learned that strength wasn't found in walls, but in the courage to open them. And as they walked down the quiet street together, side by side, Denver stretched out before them, familiar, yet entirely new. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole wasn't chasing success. He was walking toward purpose, and the world, in its quiet way, seemed to make room for it. 2 years passed quietly without headlines, without spectacle, without the noise that had once surrounded Ethan Cole's life. The world had moved on, as it always does. The storm faded into memory. The rumors dissolved into dust. But somewhere in Denver, in a modest brick building tucked between a flower shop and a bookstore, something new had taken root. Cole and Morgan Consulting. It wasn't the tallest building in the city, nor the most impressive. There was no marble lobby, no wall of accolades. Yet, every morning, when the sunlight spilled through its large windows, it illuminated something rare. People who believed in what they were building. Ethan arrived early, as he always had. Old habits remained, but their purpose had changed. Instead of reviewing financial reports or stock projections, he now spent his mornings reading letters, thank you notes from companies that had rediscovered their humanity, from employees who said his firm had helped them feel seen again. His office was simple now, no skyline view, no imposing desk. Just a round wooden table, 2 chairs, a coffee pot that never seemed to stop brewing, and walls covered not with framed awards, but with photos, smiling teams, handwritten messages, moments of connection. Grace entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She wore her hair pulled back, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, the kind of casual elegance that came from confidence rather than effort. Morning, she said, setting his cup down. Ethan looked up, smiling. "You still remember how I take it? Old habits," she said lightly. "Some are worth keeping." He chuckled, that low, quiet laugh she'd grown to love. "You're right about that." They had become partners in every sense, not romantically. Not in the way stories often insist upon, but in the deeper, steadier way two souls can walk side by side without needing to prove anything. They were kindred minds, bound by shared purpose, shaped by storms that had taught them both the cost of forgetting one's heart. Their company had started with just the two of them and a single client willing to take a chance. Now, 2 years later, Cole and Morgan Consulting had grown into a respected name across industries, not for profit margins or flashy marketing, but for its quiet impact. They helped companies rebuild trust. They taught leaders how to listen. They helped organizations heal from the inside out. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. And that, Ethan often thought, was enough. That afternoon, they sat in the conference room after a long meeting with a team from Seattle. The air still carried traces of laughter and gratitude. The clients had left with handshakes, the kind that came from genuine connection, not obligation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "They'll do fine," he said. Grace nodded. They just needed permission to be human again. He smiled at that. "Seems to be our business model." Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky over the Rockies in shades of amber and rose. The mountains stood tall and steady, silent witnesses to everything that changed and everything that stayed. Ethan poured the last of the coffee into their cups. Grace joined him by the window, where the glass reflected the golden light across their faces. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. In the silence, Ethan thought about how far they had come, not just in miles or achievements, but in peace. He remembered the man he had been, the untouchable executive, hidden behind glass and titles. And now, here he was, a man who shook hands easily, who met eyes without flinching, who reached out instead of retreating. He wore no suit today, just a light blue shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. There was something profoundly freeing about simplicity. The world that had once demanded perfection now saw him as he truly was, flawed, softened, alive. Grace took a sip of her coffee, her gaze following the line of the mountains. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. He turned to her. "What?" "The old life, the power, the noise." He considered her question for a long moment, then shook his head. "I used to think power was the goal," he said slowly. "Now I realize it was just armor. What I have now, this..." He gestured toward the office, the sunlight, her. "This feels like breathing." Grace smiled, a warmth rising in her chest. "I think that's what you were meant to do all along." "Maybe," he said softly. "But it took a storm to teach me how." They stood there together, watching as the last of the daylight slipped behind the Rockies. The room grew dim, the sky deepening into shades of violet and silver. The hum of the city below was distant, almost like the sound of waves in another world. Grace set her cup down and looked at him. "You know, it's strange. People always think healing looks like a miracle. But really, it just looks like this." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Coffee and spreadsheets." She laughed, shaking her head. "No, quiet mornings, honest work, the courage to care again." He smiled at her words, his gaze soft. "You've always had the right definition." "Maybe," she said, "but you're the one who finally lived it." Their eyes met, steady and unhurried. It was the kind of connection that didn't demand explanation. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide. Outside, the world carried on, people rushing home, traffic lights blinking in the dusk. But here, in this small office overlooking the mountains, time felt kind. Grace reached for her mug again, brushing his hand lightly as she did. The touch was casual, natural, and yet, like always, it carried something sacred. He smiled at her, that familiar quiet smile that had once belonged to a man afraid to be touched. Now, it belonged to someone who had learned how to live. Neither of them said goodbye when they left that night. They didn't have to. Their partnership, their friendship, their quiet mission, none of it required ceremony. It simply existed, as steady and sure as the mountains outside their window. And as the door closed behind them, the office light stayed on, reflecting in the glass where their two coffee cups still sat side by side, symbols of a promise kept. Because sometimes, the truest measure of success isn't what you build, but who you become while building it. And for Ethan Cole and Grace Morgan, that was more than enough. 2 years can change the shape of a man's life, but time also has a way of circling back, bringing old faces to new doors. It was a bright morning in early spring. Sunlight filtered through the wide glass windows of Cole and Morgan Consulting, warming the hardwood floors and the scent of coffee that always filled the air. Ethan was reviewing a proposal with Grace when the receptionist's voice came softly through the intercom. "Mr. Cole, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." Ethan glanced at Grace. Did he give a name? A pause. Nathan Hale. For a brief moment, the world seemed to go quiet. Grace looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes, and in that shared silence, an old weight returned the name that once echoed through the boardrooms of their past, sharp and cold as glass. Ethan exhaled slowly. Send him in. When Nathan Hale stepped through the door, time seemed to blur. He looked older, his hair grayer, his posture less sure. The man who had once embodied corporate power now carried the air of someone humbled by life's reminders that control is always temporary. His tailored suit remained impeccable, but his eyes held something new: fatigue. "Ethan," he began, his voice lower than Ethan remembered. "It's been a while." Ethan rose from his chair, extending his hand. The handshake was firm but calm. It was the kind of gesture that once would have terrified him, not for what it was, but for what it meant. Now, it felt natural, grounded. He had learned that touch, when offered with integrity, was not a threat. It was connection. Hale looked around the office, its warm tones, the photographs of smiling employees from different companies, the handwritten notes of gratitude pinned to the corkboard near the door. It was a world far removed from the sterile corridors of his own empire. "This place," Hale said softly, "it's not what I expected." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's the point." They sat. Grace joined them, her presence quiet but steady. The same calm that had once guided Ethan through storms now radiating across the room. Hale's gaze lingered on her for a moment, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even remorse. "I suppose you both know why I'm here," he said finally. Ethan waited. "There's been an incident," Hale continued, "a major one. One of our executives was accused of harassment. The media's already calling it a cultural failure. Investors are pulling back. Employees are resigning." He paused, his voice tightening. "We built something massive, but now it feels like it's collapsing under its own weight." Grace listened quietly, her expression soft but discerning. "And you want us to help rebuild?" Hale nodded. "Yes, if you're willing." The room went still again, but this time it was not an uncomfortable silence, it was reflective. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who once demanded Ethan choose between humanity and reputation now sat before him, asking for guidance on how to bring humanity back into his own. Ethan folded his hands, thoughtful. "You know, Nathan," he said gently, "when I left the company, you told me the world forgives success, but not weakness." Hale looked down. "I remember." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "But maybe we both misunderstood. Maybe what the world really can't forgive is the absence of humanity." The words settled between them with quiet gravity. For a long moment, Hale didn't respond. His eyes glistened, just enough to betray the weight he carried. "I used to think empathy was softness," he said finally. "Now I realize it's the only thing that holds people together." Grace smiled faintly. "It's never too late to relearn that." Hale turned to her. You always understood it, didn't you? She didn't answer with words, just a gentle nod that carried both forgiveness and perspective. Ethan stood and walked toward the window, the same way he always did when he needed clarity. The Denver skyline stretched beyond the glass, sharp and golden in the morning light. He remembered a time when this view had meant dominance. Now, it reminded him of grace, the quiet kind that comes from having fallen and risen differently. He turned back to Hale. "We'll help," he said finally. "But not in the way you're expecting. We won't restore what you had. We'll help you rebuild something better." Hale's voice cracked slightly. "And what would that take?" Ethan crossed the room and extended his hand again, not as a rival, but as a teacher, as a man who had once stood in the same shadow. "Touch teaches humility. Mr. Hale." Hale hesitated, then clasped his hand. This time, the gesture carried no power, no performance, only truth. Grace watched quietly, her heart full. She had seen Ethan's journey from fear to freedom, from control to compassion. To witness this moment, a full circle of redemption and humility, was something almost sacred. They spent the next hour discussing strategy. But beneath the business talk ran a deeper current. It wasn't about damage control. It was about healing, about teaching a culture that had forgotten people were not assets, but souls. When Hale finally rose to leave, he looked different, not younger, but lighter. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying yes." Ethan nodded. "We don't fix people, Nathan. We remind them what they already knew before the world made them forget." Hale smiled faintly, his voice trembling with sincerity. "Then remind me, Ethan, remind all of us." When he was gone, Grace turned to Ethan. That must have felt strange. He considered that for a moment. It did. He admitted, but also, right. She walked to the window beside him, following his gaze to the mountains in the distance. "It's funny," she said softly. "Life always finds a way to bring things full circle." He nodded, watching the sunlight break over the Rockies, the peaks glowing gold against the morning sky. "Maybe it's not about circles," he said. "Maybe it's about spirals. We come back to the same places, but each time, we're a little higher, a little wiser." Grace smiled at that. "I like that version better." Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, but inside, the air carried something different, a quiet sense of peace, of purpose renewed. Ethan turned back to his desk, picking up a letter that had arrived earlier that morning. It was from a small company in Kansas City, another client seeking guidance. He handed it to Grace. "Looks like we're still needed." She took it, her hand brushing his, and smiled. "Good. The world could use a little more empathy." He looked at her, his eyes warm with the kind of gratitude that doesn't need words. "Yes," he said softly, "it could." And as the morning sun filled the room, casting long golden lines across their office, Ethan Cole realized something profound, that in a world obsessed with profit and power, the real revolution had always been something far simpler: the courage to care. Evening settled over Denver with the gentleness of a memory. The office lights had dimmed, leaving only the soft golden glow of a floor lamp and the wide expanse of glass that framed the skyline. Outside, clouds gathered slowly, quiet, deliberate, like a painter returning to a half-finished canvas. Ethan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching as the first raindrops began to fall. It wasn't a heavy rain, just a fine mist that blurred the lights of the city, turning sharp lines into softened halos. Denver in the rain always reminded him of beginnings. Grace was still at her desk, finishing an email, her fingers moving calmly across the keyboard. The years had added a quiet confidence to her, an ease that came not from control, but from understanding. When she finally rose and walked toward him, she carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising like breath in the cool air. "Looks like the rain's back," she said, handing him a cup. He smiled, taking it from her. "It always finds its way back eventually." They stood side by side, their reflections merging faintly on the glass. The city stretched before them, alive, imperfect, beautiful. The rain tapped against the window, a rhythm both familiar and distant, echoing something they had once lived through together. For a long moment, neither spoke. It wasn't the silence of strangers, nor the stillness of routine. It was the kind of quiet that belongs only to people who have survived something profound and learned to carry peace within it. Grace broke the silence first, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Do you ever miss the storm?" Ethan turned slightly, his gaze still on the rain. "Sometimes," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "But only because it brought you to me." She looked at him for a moment, her expression gentle, touched by something deeper than nostalgia. Then she smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach for words, because words could only make it smaller. The rain grew steadier, drawing long, shimmering lines down the glass. Somewhere below, the city continued its steady hum traffic, laughter, life, but up here, time felt suspended. The moment held its breath. Grace set her cup down on the sill, folding her arms lightly. "You know," she said, "I used to think storms were something you just had to survive. But maybe they're also what wake us up." Ethan nodded slowly. "They remind us what matters. Or who." He smiled at that quietly, gratefully. It wasn't the kind of love story that people wrote about in novels. There had been no grand declarations, no fireworks, no promises sealed with forever. What they had built was something quieter, something steady and real, a connection shaped by storms and softened by time. They had found a rhythm together, days filled with purpose, work that healed, coffee that never quite got finished because conversations always lingered a little too long. And in all of it, a kind of peace that came from knowing they had both walked through the fire and chosen kindness on the other side. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, low and tender, like the voice of the past calling but not haunting, just reminding. Grace tilted her head slightly, watching the sky shift from gray to violet. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Ethan took a sip of his coffee, his voice calm, reflective. "Every day, and sometimes, I still can't believe it. Believe what she asked, that after everything, I can stand here and feel grateful for the storm." Her eyes softened. "Because it broke you." He shook his head. "Because it rebuilt me." The rain slowed, turning to a drizzle that left the city glistening, renewed. The glass before them shimmered faintly, catching the reflection of their faces side by side. Two people who had learned that healing doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. Grace leaned against the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, when we first met, I thought you were made of stone." Ethan laughed quietly. "I was. And now," he looked at her, his eyes warm. "Now, I'm just learning to stay soft." They both smiled, their laughter blending with the gentle rhythm of rain. Outside, the world had changed countless times since that night in the mountains. Companies had risen and fallen, people had come and gone. But some things the human heart, the need for connection, the quiet courage of kindness had stayed the same. Ethan set his cup down beside hers. For a moment, he simply looked out at the horizon, where the last light of evening faded into the storm's gray veil. "Funny thing about storms," he said softly. "They always leave the air cleaner." Grace nodded, "and the world a little more alive." He turned to her then, and their eyes met steady, certain, kind. There was no need for anything more. They stood there until the rain began to fade, replaced by the cool, clear calm that always follows. The city lights sparkled once more through the mist, each drop of water catching and reflecting their glow like 1,000 small miracles. And in that stillness, as the world settled into its quiet rhythm, the story found its ending not with drama or despair, but with peace. Because not all storms are meant to destroy. Some come to wash away the dust, to test the roots, to remind us what still stands when the noise is gone. Some storms change the world outside, others change the world within. The rain whispered its final song against the glass, and the lights of Denver shimmered like a living memory. And for Ethan Cole and Grace Morgan, two souls once lost in silence, but now found in meaning, the storm had long since passed. But its lessons, they carried forever. In the end, Ethan Cole's story isn't just about wealth, power, or even love. It's about rediscovering the simple, quiet strength of being human. For years, he believed that distance kept him safe, that control could protect him from pain. But what he learned is something many of us forget. As we grow older, the heart doesn't break because it feels too much. It breaks because it's been silent too long. Sometimes life asks us to face the storms we've spent years avoiding, the grief, the fear, the memories we've locked away. Yet, as Ethan discovered, when we stop running and finally allow ourselves to feel, we begin to heal. Touch, kindness, presence. These are not signs of weakness. They are proof of life, the courage to reach out, to forgive, to love again. Even after loss, that's where strength truly begins. So, if you've built walls to survive, remember this. They were never meant to be permanent. Let the rain in. Let someone close. Because storms will come. Yes, but sometimes they don't take anything from us. Sometimes they give us back ourselves. Thank you for spending your time with Shining Stories. If Ethan and Grace's journey touched something in your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, healing, and the quiet power of the human spirit to life. Every story we tell is a light, and with you here, that light shines a little brighter. See you in the next story.